What if the Tetrarchy never collapsed?
What Diocletian has chosen to do?
Diocletian's other major reform is to divide the empire between four co-emperors.
Addresses a number of the concerns and a number of the challenges the empire faced in the 3rd century.
Constantine was sent off to the court of Diocletian.
One element that Diocletian brings in is a redefinition of the way frontiers were to be defended.
He was extremely concerned.
What would happen if the planned division of the Roman Empire was never undone? What if the empire was permanently divided, but also united? And what now? With the precise date of its fall being given as 324 AD, the subject of the Tetrarchy could be as controversial as Emperor Tiberius and what he did to those children on his private island of Capri. And very much like the position of an emperor, the Tetrarchy itself was viewed as an institution, kept alive and formally enacted for barely over 30 years. Many Romans born before its formation would go on to live through its entire existence, with the historical ascension of Constantine the Christian known by anyone who bothers to read. However, when this future emperor went on to crown himself, when he merged the fragmented empire into one, the cracks from old were never fully healed, leading in time to the eventual split of the empire once again, but now under dire circumstances and unfriendly terms. The informal implementation of the Diarchy in the centuries before had already put the writing on the wall, metaphorically, with this rule of two still being considered as a failure by Diocletian, and encouraging him, with his co-emperor's consent, to expand the imperial office. And while the Diarchy had a much larger impact than the Tetrarchy, its inventor, Emperor Diocletian, could, by any aspect, be considered a man without equal, doing the same thing that Sulla did in Rome so long in the past. Not only did he divide power between himself and the other existing co-emperor, with the later implication that each was equal, he also went on to retire and retreat into private life after a successful rule of over 30 years. And yet, just 1 year after he relinquished his imperial title, the institution that Diocletian fought so hard to enact quickly began to crack. Instilled first by the death of Constantius and the Western armies hailing his son as the new Western emperor, but then later that same year, when Maxentius rebelled against the newly crowned co-emperor in Italy, Valerius Severus. Looking back on this moment and the foundation of the Tetrarchy as a whole, we must wonder if the institution was designed to be anti-dynasty. Surely, when Diocletian first found himself as the only emperor, he could have just named a family member as his co-emperor. Sadly, it isn't that simple to tell, since Diocletian was born a low-status peasant with most preservations of his family life, before the purple, being lost to time. And to the best of our knowledge, Diocletian had no existing male family to promote. And so the implication would then be the opposite. The Tetrarchy wasn't just designed to divide the responsibilities of defense, it was also meant to create and expand the personal dynasty that Diocletian himself never truly had, with some historians implying that the ascension of Galerius later on was even inspired by his own family relation to Diocletian's wife. The question must then be asked, at what precise moment did the Tetrarchy fully collapse? Most people would focus on the ascension of Constantine and the assumption that his soldiers were the one to declare him as the emperor. But if we hold on to the author, David Stone Potter, and the accusation he's asserted that it wasn't Constantine who made himself the emperor, but his own father, as his last dying act, then we, as readers of the lore, must also assume that Constantine the Christian never personally fought to promote himself. Once Constantius died, his implied selection of his firstborn son should have been, by all accounts, a legal appointment under Roman law. And this is when the truest flaw of the Tetrarchy was fully displayed for all to read and all to see. That's why the first major change in this story is going to be something that many people might consider extremely minor and irrelevant: the promotion of Valerius Severus in the first place, 1 year before the death of Constantius I. Now, looking back in the past, if Emperor Maximian wanted his son to be his heir, he would have named him instead of Valerius Severus, since Maximian was the senior Western emperor at the time, and by all understanding, he should have made the final decision. But this, much like many things in ancient Rome, is easy to talk about on a surface level, while much more complex the deeper we go. For many reasons, the eastern half of the Roman Empire, even as early as 285, was already the richest portion of land. It is also worth reminding ourselves that while Diocletian did create the Tetrarchy and volunteer to share power, he himself always made sure to hoard and maintain the most of it. And if the words of Lactantius hold any value, Diocletian chose Valerius Severus with reluctance, only after Galerius convinced him to do so, giving us, the reader, the implication that Diocletian had final say over the West, not Maximian. None of this can be allowed if we want the Tetrarchy to survive for more than one generation, not when the physical creator of the institution is the same person who undermines it, treating the later periods of his rule as if they were the same during his early reign. And during that time, during the Diarchy that preceded Constantius and Galerius, Maximian and Diocletian did indeed share titles that fully displayed their difference in stature. But even later on, after Rome was cut into 4 pieces, Diocletian was still stuck in the habit of acting above everyone else, something that here and now, in our timeline, he would never do, denouncing the mere suggestion of Valerius Severus in the first place, before going on to reprimand and remind Galerius that both of them could only make decisions about the eastern half. And that is why in our timeline, when news of Constantius's death is sent to the waiting emperor, the person to receive such a message was Maxentius himself. except now he's a legal and lawful member of the Roman Tetrarchy, appointed personally by his father in 305. I would be a bad host if I failed to explain that we do not know if the father-son bond between Constantius and his heir is what inspired Maxentius in the first place. This allows us to get a complete and firm understanding of the Tetrarchy and the strict changes we're going to follow to maintain it. 2 senior emperors, 2 junior emperors, and the senior emperor in our timeline can only make decisions about their existing half, either east or west. From this point, there will be no one emperor above all, but instead a union of emperors bound together by Rome. With my own personal interpretation about the portrait of the 4 tetrarchs leading me to this conclusion. In this sculpture, the ancient emperors of old, Diocletian, Maximian, Galerius, and Constantius, are all depicted wearing the same military dress. Who is who, and which is which? That's the point, because they were all the same person. They were all the emperor divided into 4, but united as one. And since Maximian will never emerge from retirement, since Maxentius obtained the purple toga without bloodshed or rebellion, the largest renovation of Rome as a capital city would go on to become his entire legacy. And if we circle back to the death of Constantius with the implication that his personal promotion of Constantine would still occur, none of the original side effects would be triggered, as Constantius was well within his legal right as the senior emperor. And just like that, by removing Valerius Severus, by preventing Diocletian from overextending the power he himself already gave up, we are left with no historical rhyme or reason to trigger the very same civil wars that destroyed the Tetrarchy. In my own personal opinion, the diarchy that preceded and later succeeded this system was, in many ways, worse than just having one emperor, while the Tetrarchy was superior in almost every single aspect and season. There is a reason Diocletian made his base of power in the east. There is a reason Constantine moved the capital to the east. There is a reason the Eastern Roman Empire survived almost 1,000 years longer than the Western one. And the simple fact was, once the empire was split in 2, the eastern half was obviously better, but if the empire remained as 4, if power was divided just a little more, the story changes entirely. What I'm talking about is the answer to the question, which province is the best to rule during the Tetrarchy? Which of the regions, if you controlled, would you be able to conspire or overwhelm your Roman neighbors? Many of the people listening to this might rush to lay claim upon the same western lands that Constantine did, seeing the valuable legions and veterans from the recent civil wars in those lands. Others might think of the cultural heartland, the Italian peninsula, and the sacred city of Rome that rested at its center. Some would suggest the lands of Galerius and the ownership of what would go on to be Constantinople. And only the bravest among us would double down and make the decision of Diocletian, bordering what was the largest and strongest non-Roman state, and something that none of his neighbors had to deal with. But all of these explanations, with hindsight, shed better light, and the fact that all four tetrarchs have much better designs than most people realize. For example, did the far western lands have the most experienced veterans? Yes, but it also bordered the Rhine, Hadrian's Wall, and a near endless tide of barbarians who came to sack their coastline. Did the central province of Italy and Africa have any outside threat to deal with? No, but it had plenty of internal conflicts, a deep financial struggle, and it was in the worst position for apathy. Did Galerius have historical lands and plenty of veterans with good trade in Ilaria? Yes, but he also bordered the Danube, which by itself could be its own 24-hour job, crossed every other day by another barbarian. Did Diocletian lay claim to Egypt and the Levant, to Anatolia and the taxes that came from them? Yes, but as I previously stated, he also had to constantly deal, either through battle or words, with the Persians. And only with all four of these positive and negative positions can we understand that all of them were equal. No one single emperor, whether they be senior or junior, could turn his attention to deal with another without weakening themselves to outside powers. In the original story, the warring emperors took sides to destroy each other until 4 became 2. With none of this happening here, with the past promotions of both Maxentius and Constantine seen as legal and lawful, to the best of my knowledge, the next couple of years could almost be called a miniature Golden Age. Going back to Maxentius with this premise in mind, without his early rule being plagued by civil war, and without the instigations of his own usurpation, he would be left alone to his private projects and personal schemes to build and beautify the city of Rome. With his original death spelling the end for the eternal city, as none who came after him kept it as the imperial capital, here, in our timeline, he's able to enact and pursue all the plans that Constantine originally foiled, while the latter himself would surely be kept busy building fortifications on the Rhine. And since so many historians have already focused on what Constantine did, let's instead keep our attention on what Maxentius did. In the lore, he immediately restored the power of the Praetorian Guard. He also, while at constant civil war, built the Temple of Romulus, repaired several other temples of old, built a new basilica in his name, and his own complex on the Palatine Hill. With all of this being done in our timeline, even after his original death, he was still remembered as a great builder, and now these monuments would spread up across the entire city. And while I want to say he would be perfect, while I want to imply that everything from here would be completely fine, I don't want this story to be a power fantasy about Rome. I want an authentic timeline to answer our question. That's why I haven't mentioned Licinius one single time, because without the illegal ascension of Maxentius, Galerius would have no need to war with him, and the Tetrarchy as a whole would have over half a decade to heal any wounds. All of this would lead to our next change, the economic collapse of Maxentius and his inability to raise more money, something he would do to himself by his constant building and the weird tax sensation that Italy was placed into. Without the rest of the empire to fund his monuments, without the money to raise new legions, his options would quickly become limited. In many ways, Maxentius was way ahead of his time. He saw the decay of Rome as a city, and he tried to fix it. He saw the poorly aged infrastructure that held the capital together, and he alone fought to upgrade them. For so long had those in Italy been able to keep their ears shut and eyes closed. But just because he was right, that doesn't mean anybody actually liked him for doing what needed to be done. And I could see any number of directions and turns our story could take from this pivotal moment. With Galerius dying and Maximinius II becoming the senior Eastern emperor, who would he pick as his junior heir? Would this economic downturn be enough to encourage the Tetrarchy to collapse? Would Constantine even be a Christian if he never sees the implied comet before his original battle with Maxentius? Unfortunately, the answer to these questions, like many things, can only be found during another day and another episode.